Welcome to the Happy in the Mess podcast. We are your hosts, Marlena, Sherry, and Matthew. We are therapists and coaches, and we want to share our own stories with you, as well as the wisdom, insights, and tips we've learned along the way. Thanks for tuning in to this episode. Welcome to this episode of the Happy in the Mess podcast. I'm Sherry, and I'm here with our resident expert extraordinaires, Matthew and Marlena. Today, we're going to talk about vulnerability hangovers. I have to admit, I'm really excited to host this episode. I've got a lot of questions about this idea of vulnerability hangovers. Before I forget, let me remind you, please like, share, comment, rate, and review on whatever platform you listen to. It might seem a little unnecessary, but it makes a huge difference to those who are searching for answers for these kind of questions. You can also find each of us on our own platforms, creating our own happy magic. Let's hear from each of our coaches and where we can find them. Marlena, can you tell our listeners where to find you and what you're working on?
Yeah, you can find me at coachmarlena.com. And right now I'm holding a Flash Valentine's Day sale. So you can get a hold of me there. And I am working on, getting through this launch. I'm doing this 30% off my heartbreak course for those going through a breakup, as well as a deal breakers blueprint for people to figure out what their boundaries are in relationships and what are deal breakers. And lastly, Swipe Right, which is a 30-minute one-on-one coaching call if you're interested in getting back into the online dating pool, because we all know that can be very challenging. Well, maybe you two don't know, but for those of us singles, it can be very challenging. Anyway, yeah, so thanks for letting me share that, Sherry.
Oh, thank you so much. I know your programs are great. Matthew, what about you?
For those of us dating when AOL was still coming out on floppy disks, I don't know about that, but no, I'm Matthew, and you can find me at matthewemorgan.com or Misfit Refuge. And really, we're just kind of a place for neurodivergent spiritual people to hang out, chill, kind of start to develop really who we are. And we're doing that as a practice as well. So I've got a geek therapy segment kind of in the works right now, kind of based off of some bounty hunter type stuff, and just letting the nerd fly, but just in a sense of like holistically finding ourselves. So there's more information on the website about that.
Yeah, we can't wait to see what your programs are going to look like because I know the work you're doing is really important. So I'm Sherry Timko. I'm a couples relationship coach, and I can be found at sherrytimko.com. One of the reasons that I'm so excited to have this discussion with you guys is that I am in the middle of a 30-day challenge to do a social media blitz. And of course, I'm launching the latest group for my couples dating program. And I am like steeped in this vulnerability hangover. Like, putting myself out there has been I've just had so many reactions to it. So I'm really curious what you guys can do and give us in terms of tips to help us really move through this and make sense of it. Let's start at the easy question. What is a vulnerability hangover and what causes it?
Well, this was a term coined by Brené Brown, and she describes it as the feeling of shame you have after you've taken an emotional risk. So when you've maybe asked someone out on a date or asked your partner for an intimate moment, or like you said, becoming an entrepreneur and like being visible to thousands and thousands of people. All of these things can produce a feeling of, oh my God, what did I just do? I want to crawl into a hole and die.
The first one jumps to mind is Steve Urkel, and you go back and you look at the mess that just happened behind you, and you're like, oh, did I do that? And it's like and it can be real, it can be imaginary. It's there's all sorts of nuances to it, but it really is. It's that feeling of shame that just bubbles up, and we've talked about emotions in past episodes and feelings and how to handle it. So definitely for those that want to dive into that section after you're done listening to this one, it'd be great to go back and check out some of those too if you haven't already. But I think it's a very normal feeling. And I love when Brené Brown, I remember watching her TED talk when she said that, and I was like, oh, it's like, that's a perfect term for it. Like that idea of that hangover, of just that after effect feeling of like, oh, I did something that I'm not comfortable with.
Yeah, or I did something that I was comfortable with in the moment, but I didn't really think it through. So
Mm,
then I get out of the situation and I wonder if I overshared or if I like revealed too much of myself. I was talking about the social media, but I also get this when I spend time with friends and share a lot. And then I leave that situation. I'm like, oh no, what do they think of me? Like
Mhm.
that didn't come off really great. And I go into all of these thoughts that are about self-doubt and trying to figure out how someone else is thinking of me.
Yeah, it feels like an intense fear of judgment, either from others, but it's also sort of the negative self-talk that happens. Like, did I share something that I'm not actually comfortable with, or that I might judge myself for, and so it comes from, it seems like both sides, like the fear of what someone else is thinking, but also now I'm thinking poorly about myself too.
Yeah. Yeah, that idea of did I present something that they're going to take out of context and not understand that that's just a little piece of that bigger picture.
Right. And
So,
that's the risk, though, that you take, is that some people actually might judge you for it. And oftentimes, the larger you present, take the emotional risk, the larger the risk, the more likely that that actually might happen.
oh, that's scary. Man, Marlena, I never want to step out of my comfort zone again. Like, I don't want that like certainty that someone might judge me. All
Mm-hmm.
right.
well,
Okay.
but rolling back into that, like you felt that, Sherry, like that moment. And I appreciate you being vulnerable with this because and we said it earlier, it's rooted in shame. It's rooted in this feeling, right? If people look at me, well, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough for them. I'm not good enough for whatever's going on. And shame gets a really bad rap. And I've been very anti-shame, but as I've been studying it more and working with people, it has a purpose. If you think of terms of us being a tribal or a herd society, right? Shame kind of is that indicator that, well, I've just wandered outside the herd, and it's like there is a sense of vulnerability if you're out there, but that's also the place where people lead from. That's where people start to move, potentially can move the herd or move others there. But there is that momentary, I'm
Mm-hmm.
hanging out here and it doesn't feel good. And we're constantly checking our feels and our thinks at the same time here.
Mm-hmm.
You guys know I talk about shame a lot with clients, but even hearing you say, hey, Sherry, that's shame, there's some part of me that's like, no, that's not shame. I don't have shame. And of course, you're right. Of course it is. But I just want to like kind of explain it away as something else because it feels so uncomfortable to even think about that that vulnerability being linked with shame.
Oh, well, for sure. And I think maybe I don't want to speak for either of you, but that I'm supposed to be this evolved therapist that helps other people through this. I shouldn't have to, I should be above this feeling of shame, or above this, not caring what people think. And like, that's not true. I'm very human, and that is still a thing. And like Matthew shared, I mean, sometimes the shame is an indication that we've wandered away from the herd, but oftentimes that is a perception, not reality either. And even when people are being like, I've had sort of hate mail on my social media of people criticizing whatever I have shared. And I responded with compassion and understanding, also understanding that like a lot of that has nothing to do with me. This person knows me not one bit. And they were taking information from a 15-second reel, So I mean, and also being like, all right, do I really need to bring this close to my heart and take it as true? Probably not. Probably not. And bless and release. Like that's not my stuff.
I'm so sorry. That's so hard to get that negative feedback on, especially when you're being vulnerable and you put yourself out there and then someone comes back and says this thing and it is hard to set it aside and say, this isn't really about me.
Mm, yeah.
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 I written a novel for a competition at one point, and you have to go up levels. And the first couple levels did really well, and I got to the point where I was like, "Oh, I'm feeling good about myself. Like this is gonna go. I'm gonna win this thing." And it got to like that crucial level where the super professional people really got in and tore it apart. And they tore it apart. They shredded this thing. Like the review is still burned in my brain because I made the mistake of Marlene, I love what you said. Put it in your heart. Like I pretty much etched that review on there, and and it was like that vulnerability hangover feeling. Like I did all of this, I failed, but then as we start to process, it's like, no, they didn't get it. There was some good feedback within there even that I could change.
Mm,
But ultimately I was like, okay, but there's still a tribe of people who really liked this in the way that it was. Um,
mm,
so I think a lot of it's just going back to that mindful. What's going on right now? Who is this person? What right do they have? And that's really as we take the shame feeling and the fear and start to coalesce it into something that's real and tangible.
mhm.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. So as I'm listening to you guys and I hear these different situations that you're talking about, I'm wondering if it's the same for close friends and family as it is for you professionally, or is there a difference there?
When you say
Like,
close friends and family, do you mean like taking the emotional risk with friends and family?
Yes, that
Gotcha.
that vulnerability hangover, what leads to it, and then that experience of it.
Well, for me, that can actually feel even more painful because I do care about friends and family up to a certain point. Like I mean, like I do value their opinion of me. They do know me better. And when I put myself out there with taking an emotional risk, whether it be like trying to reconnect with um, a former flame or trying to make amends with a sibling or whatever like that, and you put yourself out there and then you risk that rejection, it can feel awful if it's not received well. And for me, in these situations, I like to ask myself the question, what would I regret more, doing this or not doing this, to help guide the decision? Like, and I know I had a really great therapist a long time ago, used to tell me, like, when I was about to take an emotional risk, like, you'll be okay no matter what. Like, and also helping me check my motives, like, what am I doing this for? And if I do not receive the response I'm hoping for, I will still be proud of myself that I was brave enough to do this thing. And I've also heard like the things we regret in life are usually not the risks we took, but the ones we didn't. And so realizing like there's nothing serious going on here. I might feel a little hurt and my heart might like hurt a little bit, but ultimately like no one's dying. Like I just have to remind myself like it's not that big a deal. And 10 years from now, it will not affect me the same way and I will not perceive it the same way. And probably a week from then it won't, like just taking some perspective on this. Like yes, it's a risk and I don't want to regret not having done it. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. I have, that's how the game I play with myself when I'm about to do something like that.
All right, so I have to ask because I do think a lot of people carry these things for a long time. So you
Mm,
said maybe it wouldn't make a difference in a week, or maybe it wouldn't make a difference in 10 years. But how do you get to that point where you can put that down? Because I think we have a tendency to hold that.
that's a great question. I'm curious. I'm going to lob it over to Matthew first.
oh my goodness, I'm just kind of processing the big picture at large here. But I think, and I'm going to kind of, I think maybe ease back into it. But this idea of you use the term risk versus reward. Um, and your first question, Sherry, was like, is this different with friends or family? And it's, if I offend Joe Bob with my reel, I don't care because there's not a high risk with it. There's also not a high reward.
Mm,
With my family members, there is, and the closer that is to me, as we move in through social circles, and into people who are part of our lives, there's a very high degree of anxiety that goes with that, because we run a risk of a bigger rejection. What are they going to think about me?
mm,
And then going back into the how do we get over that? Because and I may even lob that back to you, Sherry, because I'm sure as a marriage person, you see where, even in a couple, which is a really tight relationship, that there are people who can hold on to secrets or vulnerabilities for an extended period of time. And as far as how long it goes, I think, and I'm gonna roll back right back into Brené Brown because she's the one that says that if we share our vulnerability, essentially, I'm paraphrasing her here, but right, if we share our vulnerability, our shame, with somebody who responds with love and empathy, then that can't survive. But you have to get to that point to bring it to the light first. And until it stays in the dark, it's just going to, or as long as it stays in the dark, it's going to grow.
Yeah, that's things hidden in the dark will fester, and
Oh
you
yeah.
have to bring them out into the light. I guess the other thing, as I was listening to you talk, what I was thinking is how often that vulnerability hangover is connected with perfectionism, which of course is another one of Brené Brown's
Mhm.
topics that she studies, and that some of letting go of vulnerability hangovers has to be forgiving yourself for not being perfect in the situation.
Mhm.
Yeah. And a lot of times I'll roll back with this idea, did we do the best we could in a particular time given the information? Because we really can look back and say, oh, I should have done this, which again is that vulnerability hangover part. Um, I love the idea. I'm working with neurodivergent, misfit people. Like I tell them oftentimes, there was a meme about this, was a lot of times we're so bright to know that we're awkward, but we're not smart enough to know how to overcome that awkwardness.
Mm.
So it does kind of sit and fester in there, and oh, I should have done this. I should have gone back to that, and we should all over ourselves. And until we give ourselves that grace and maybe that understanding, it's going to kind of sit there and fester as well.
Yeah. I can't emphasize the importance of having what you just said, because I was thinking back to my previous hangups that maybe I had festered on for longer than a year, things that felt very vulnerable, and subsequently I felt shame, and what dissipated it, time really helped. But also, yeah, talking to other people and realizing like I'm not the only one who's had those experiences, and having the love and empathy of others. But also, I've been taught to bookend really tough emotional risks with people who understood what I was about to do, and who I could call before I was going to do it, and after I was going to do it. Like, I would make sure there was a bookend person for me hanging out in the wings, so that like when I needed to get out of the boxing ring and get a towel and a drink, that they would clean me up a little bit if I needed it. And I'm really grateful I have people like that in my life who are going to just love and accept me no matter what. And I tell, and they're my bookend people. And that's been very helpful to help me get through it. And, a little pep talk afterward, and we just get back in there.
That dovetails into what Matthew asked about couples. And one of the things that I work with couples to do is to create this sacred space. And you can show up as who you are, even in your messiness, if you've got that sacred space. But it does take a good amount of safety and trust to be able to show up and be messy and talk about really hard things with your partner, and have confidence that they're not going to judge you and they're not going to use that against you in a argument later. So it is a hard thing to achieve. Well, maybe it's not a hard thing. It just takes being intentional and being kind and really cleaning up the ways that you hurt each other, so that those things don't keep you from having that kind of honesty together.
Mm, I love that. Yeah.
So
It's
is there any benefit to having a vulnerability hangover? We've been talking a lot about the cost, but is there anything good about this?
I do think for me, with time, having, especially if I share the same thing over and over in different spaces, it begins to lose its mm, novelty sense of anxiety that is associated with it. And then I just become more open and transparent as a person. And and then it's just no big deal. And I love it when finally my vulnerabilities become like no real big deal, to me, to share them. I'm like, oh yeah, I've shared that many times, no big deal. Because
Mhm.
then I realize that most people don't think of it as a big deal either. Um, and that I am the center of my own universe, as is everyone, and no one's thinking about me that hard when they go home. Like, like I am not the center of most people's universe. So most people are going to forget what I shared anyway. And even if they do remember, it's not a constant thought. And I have to remember that, like, we're sort of egocentric in this way. No one's thinking about us other than us most of the
Mhm.
time. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I appreciate that. When I was in Bible college, I preached a sermon that if it could go wrong, it did. It was just one of these start to finish, tripped over my words, equipment failure, like, and I just got done. And it's just one of those where you just hope that a hole opens up and you can crawl into it and go away for an extended period of time. And my pastor, John Brady, amazing man who's just big guy, very loving, and he came over and he shared some of his vulnerabilities, which I think is one benefit is when we have those moments, we can empathize with other people. We can really understand, and when we see somebody else suffering, we can go to them and not continue to shame them. And that really develops that skill. And I remember him doing that. And to what you said, Marlena, like months later, I had somebody else come to me and he was saying, hey, my wife really, she was talking about this particular message and, how great it was and impactful. And I was like, was that the same one I was at? Because that was not a good moment. But it's that idea of there's a lot more to it. And we really see our flaws so magnified. And that vulnerability, the more we tap into it, the more we realize that it's not a bad thing to stray out a little bit further. So.
And I would also say with that, Matthew, this is a good example of how it can create strengthen bonds or intimacy or draw people to us. Like that softness that comes with being vulnerable is very attractive. It's hard to love like a perfect machine. Like it's just like there's no flaws that are adorable or anything. Like there is something beautiful about the messiness and being flawed and not being perfect and sharing some failure, like the hero's journey, of failure and then a win, is so deeply entrenched in all culture. People like to read about this kind of thing, people being vulnerable and experiencing shame and loss and failure and then rising out of it. This is a beautiful story it's just attractive, makes people attractive. I mean, not just in a romantic sense, but we're drawn to people who are that courageous and flawed.
Yeah, that vulnerability can really strengthen the relationship and let you know each other well. I think the hangover part of it is also something that can be a little bit helpful. At least I try to think of it that way because it gets me to kind of look at the situation and see if I was prematurely being vulnerable in a relationship that couldn't handle it, or if I was sharing something that I hadn't processed well enough that I could share it without, I don't know, spilling on to other people or not able to come to any conclusions. So I don't love a vulnerability hangover and I can get myself into them so easily. But I do find that there's at least that pause that makes me say, well, what does this mean?
I like that, Sherry, because sometimes you're right. Sometimes we do share prematurely and the relationship's not ready for it. You weren't ready for it, perhaps, and that's very true. That's an invitation to perhaps take a step back or share more selectively.
So as we get ready to wrap up, I have to ask you guys about how we can avoid a vulnerability hangover. Now, I'll be honest, I am really good at getting into them, and now I'm pretty good at recognizing when I'm in a vulnerability hangover. And sometimes I can even anticipate that I'm going to have one, but I haven't figured out a way to not have them. So, you guys have any wisdom on this?
I'm
Nope.
not sure you can avoid it.
I'm having the exact same thought. It's like, yeah.
Matthew and I were talking before the show how a nap and a snack solves a lot of problems. Like when I've had a vulnerability hangover, the best things I can do for myself is just take a nap and just hide out, let myself recover under the covers, and yeah, and not forget to eat.
Yeah. Well, and leaning the opposite side of this, I think the best way to avoid the vulnerability hangover is to not be vulnerable anymore. You can absolutely just cloister yourself in, lock yourself in, don't reach out, stay in your lane, turtle up, basically. That's terrible advice, by the way. So don't pull that previous sound clip out of context, because I think the hangover it's inherently connected to the idea of vulnerability. So anytime we reach out and we grow outside of our comfort zone, we're going to have growing pains. My almost 13-year-old son right now is going through growing pains. And I don't want him to hurt, but I want him to experience that because that means that someday he may actually be taller than me, which at 5'4" is a very admirable goal, right? I'm 5'4". So the question itself, I don't know that we want to avoid it, but we want to be able to process it in a way, Sherry, what you were saying, where it's smoother. It's not a college morning hangover. It's probably a January 1st hangover kind of thing. And not that I advocate any of that, but give us that ability to kind of name it, talk it out, work through it with others, find that support. And then we develop that muscle to go through the dip a little quicker.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's great.
and I would piggyback on this and also say, something I learned, I think, from Brené Brown as well. And I also do this. I don't go back and listen to things that I already started feeling emotionally cringy about. Like I just why subject myself to that? It's already out there, I can't fix it. And I prefer not to. So I just let it go and move on to the next thing, because for most people are actually, the public is quite forgiving. When I think about all the politicians and whatnot and all the atrocious things that people have done very publicly, and how our ability to move on from it, like I'm nowhere near at that level. So, I mean, I just feel like it will be forgiven and probably forgotten.
Wow, those are great pearls of wisdom. Thank you for sharing those. I talked a little bit about married couples and how vulnerability hangovers can affect them. I'm curious how it would affect each of your individual niches. Like Marlena, what about people who are dating? What about that vulnerability in that space?
Oh, one of the biggest things I see in my niche is, I'm a spiritual dating coach, is having the conversation of where are we going? That's a huge vulnerability, can be a hangover, because people are so afraid that they're not going to get the response, that there's a mutual commitment happening or whatever, because that can be the termination of the relationship. And then you're dealing with a whole nother set of sadness and grief. And other times though, both parties were so afraid to bring it up, but they were both on the same page. Either way, it is a vulnerable moment, and it helps you move forward, even if that means the termination of the relationship. And so for me, it's definitely worth it, because you need to know where you're going. If and if you're on the same page. So that's where, and then of course, just the regular asking people out and getting rejected is a common one too. But once you already started dating and having that, are you seeing anyone else? Can we just see each other? That exclusivity, DTR, define the relationship conversation can be a big one. And yeah, it sucks, but sometimes it ends up really well and sometimes it doesn't. Either way, you're moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. That's so insightful. I was immediately thinking of the asking people out, but you're right that later, where are we conversation is probably a much more impactful situation.
Well, you're already a little bit more invested, whereas just
Yeah.
asking someone random out, low investment, you haven't really done anything yet. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Matthew, what about for your niche? You tend to deal with people who are much more sensitive to this feedback from the outside. So, what about them?
Absolutely. And I think that idea of sensitive to feedback, that's the key in there for both sides. And I think as you are, particularly for highly sensitive people, we will become our worst enemies. We will flog ourselves repeatedly every time we make a mistake, because we just, again, everything is magnified. But likewise, oh, this hurts as an introvert, but I'm going to say it anyway. Marlena, what you were saying earlier is you want to surround yourself with those other voices that will build you up and let you know that you're okay. A lot of times, especially in the neurodiversity realm, I try to reframe everything in the idea of like we're building scripts. And so as something breaks, which is really where the vulnerability comes in, as something doesn't work, we're going to build a script with that information. We have data now that we can turn that into something. So if I've made eye contact too long, or if I said an inappropriate joke in public or whatever it may be, now I can say, oh, that didn't work. So I'm going to rebuild this in a way that says that person is not safe to do that with, or this person is safe to do it with. So I think a lot of those little things of just giving ourselves space to adjust, and I think acknowledge and recognize that we are on the outside of the herd anyway, typically, at least on the outside edges of it. So there's always going to be that innate feeling that we can just embrace, because that's also that gives us the best view of everything else going on too.
Mhm.
That's great
And
wisdom.
Brené Brown say that this is wholehearted living, right? The happy and the wholehearted are the people who take these risks.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If anyone's curious, Brene Brown has a lot of work around this topic, so feel free to look her up. She's got TED Talks and books and videos, and she did a special on Netflix a few years ago. So there's a lot of material about this if this really resonates with you. Thank you so much for your wisdom today. I feel like I've gained a lot just from our discussion. I also want to thank all of you, our listeners, for joining us today. Please like, share, comment, rate, and review this podcast so we can spread the word about our collective wisdom. We'd love to hear your burning questions so that we can answer them. We do respond to all of our comments, so please feel free to comment wherever you're listening. We will look forward to talking with you next week.